On a forgotten farm at the edge of a small mountain town, an old war veteran was just waiting for his days to run out, until his German shepherd scratched open the floorboards and uncovered the lie that killed half the men in this valley. He thought he was only guarding an abandoned house. Instead, God was leading him to a buried truth, broken families, and one last chance to make things right. If you believe it's never too late for justice and mercy, stay with this story. Before you begin, help us grow by subscribing. Cold mountain air slid through the narrow streets of Pine Ridge at dawn, thin as glass and just as sharp, carrying the scent of pine sap and old wood into every quiet corner of town. Walter Briggs began his mornings the same way he had for years, slowly, carefully, as if rushing might fracture something in him that never fully healed. He woke before the alarm most days, his body still trained by habits formed in darker places under louder skies, where morning meant orders and survival. Now, it meant the hum of his small electric kettle in the kitchenette of his rented room, the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath his boots, and the low, steady breath of shadow lifting and falling beside the door. Walter stood at the tiny window, steam curling from his chipped mug, watching the pale light creep over the jagged outline of the mountains beyond town. Pine Ridge was the kind of place where nothing seemed to happen quickly. Time drifted here, slow and cautious, much like the people who chose to stay. He pulled on his red and black buffalo plaid jacket, faded at the cuffs, soft with age, and slung his keys over one finger, his military watch resting heavy against his wrist, as it always did, ticking with stubborn patience. Shadow rose without a sound. The German shepherd's coat was still dark and sleek, despite a few silver threads beginning to show around the muzzle. At 6 or 7 years old, Shadow moved with the calm confidence of a dog who had learned when to act and when to wait. He watched Walter with amber eyes that missed very little, then padded forward and sat, close enough that their knees nearly touched. Walter rubbed his thumb against the warm leather of Shadow's collar. "Easy, boy," he murmured, not because Shadow needed reassuring, but because he himself did. Driving the town shuttle for seniors wasn't a job Walter had imagined for himself when he was younger. He had once carried men twice his size over broken ground, felt their weight go slack in his arms when it was already too late. Now he helped ladies with trembling hands into the passenger seat, waited patiently while old men fumbled with seat belts and apologies. He liked the rhythm of it, the predictable routes, the way the town unfolded before him, like a familiar map he no longer needed to study. The van smelled faintly of disinfectant and peppermint candies. Some of the riders talked constantly, filling the space with stories Walter half listened to. Others rode in silence, watching the trees roll by as if the movement itself were soothing. Walter never asked questions he didn't need to. He had learned long ago that most people carried more than they wanted to say out loud. At lunch, he parked beside the small grocery, ate a sandwich in the driver's seat, and tossed a strip of dried beef to Shadow through the open door. The dog caught it neatly, tail giving a single approving sway. In those small exchanges, unremarkable and easily overlooked, Walter felt something like usefulness settle gently on his shoulders. It wasn't glory. It wasn't purpose in the grand sense, but it was being needed. And that was enough to make the hours feel less hollow. Evenings were quieter. Walter returned to his rented room above a closed-down hardware store, the stairs steep and narrow, the hallway smelling faintly of dust and old paint. He set his boots neatly by the door, folded his jacket over the back of a chair, and sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows braced on his knees. Shadow lay at his feet, close without crowding him, a warm, steady presence that asked for nothing and offered everything. Sometimes sleep came easily, Other nights, it did not. On the nights when his dreams took him back to smoke and shouting and the unbearable moment of choosing who he could carry and who he would have to leave behind, Shadow was always there when he woke. The dog pressed his head against Walter's thigh, grounding him in the solid reality of breath and warmth and the faint thud of a loyal heart. Walter never spoke about those dreams. He had learned that words could cheapen memory, could reduce it to something that fit too neatly into sentences. But in the quiet between him and Shadow, nothing had to be explained. The dog's presence did not erase the past. It simply refused to let it swallow the present. On a late autumn afternoon, when the sky hung low and gray over Pine Ridge, and the air smelled faintly of rain that hadn't yet fallen, Walter's phone rang as he was locking up the shuttle for the day. The call came from the town office. A request, spoken carefully, as if the person on the other end already knew they were asking him for more than a simple favor. There was a property just outside town, an old farm that had been sitting empty for months. The family who owned it was drowning in debt, the sale tied up in paperwork and waiting on a buyer. Until then, the place needed someone to watch over it. Keep vandals out. Make sure nothing burned down. A few weeks, maybe a month at most. Walter listened without interrupting, his eyes drifting to where Shadow waited near the van, ears alert to his tone. He understood what the office was really saying. They needed someone reliable, quiet, someone who wouldn't ask questions or stir trouble. Someone with nothing tying him down. He glanced at the empty passenger seats behind him, at the quiet street stretching out beyond the curb. "I can do it," he said, surprising himself with how easily the words came. That night, he packed light. A change of clothes, his work boots, a few cans of food, and a sack of dog kibble. Nothing about the preparations felt like a departure. It felt like a temporary shift, the kind he had grown used to in another life. Move here for a while, wait, move again. The farm sat at the far edge of Pine Ridge, where the last paved road gave way to dirt and the trees thickened into forest. The drive took less than 20 minutes, but with every mile, the town fell a little farther behind him. The house itself was exactly what he expected. Weathered boards, bleached pale with age, windows dark and empty, a sagging fence that once might have kept something in or out. Silence stretched wide across the land. It pressed in on him gently, not threatening, but vast. Walter cut the engine and sat there for a moment, hands resting on the wheel. Shadow was already alert beside him, eyes scanning the long grass and the line of trees beyond. There was no fear in the dog's posture, only attention. Walter stepped out, his boots crunching softly on gravel. The air smelled older here, heavier with earth and damp leaves. This was not a place built for noise. Inside, the house was bare, but intact. Dust lay thick on every surface, the furniture covered in sheets yellowed with time. The floors creaked under his weight. Walter walked room to room, opening windows, letting light and cold air push out the stale stillness. Shadow followed at a measured distance, nose working quietly, as if cataloging each scent and corner. The dog paused at the doorway of the back room and looked at Walter, not with alarm, but with something that felt like invitation. Walter only nodded. "All right," he said. "We'll take it slow." He set their few belongings down near the hearth and built a small fire with wood stacked neatly by the wall. Someone had prepared for watchers once, or perhaps for themselves, before leaving. As the flames caught and warmth spread unevenly through the cold rooms, Walter sat on the floor with his back against the wall and let the stillness settle around him. Shadow lay down at his side, body angled just enough to block the open space behind him. A silent guardian, even in repose. Later, After the fire had burned low and night pressed in around the house, Walter stepped outside. The farm was wrapped in shadows, the land bending away into darkness. Above him, the sky was a scatter of faint stars behind thin clouds. He thought of the family that owned this place, wherever they were now, of the choices that had slowly emptied this land of voices and footsteps. It was a different kind of loss than the one he carried, but loss all the same. He felt the familiar ache stir in his chest, the question that returned in quieter moments. What use was a man who only knew how to endure? Behind him, Shadow padded out onto the porch and sat at his heel. The dog's warmth brushed his leg. Walter looked down. Shadow was watching his face with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. Not expectation, not worry, something steadier. Shadow's gaze did not ask where they were going. It simply waited with him at the edge of whatever came next. Walter reached down and rested his hand on the broad curve of the dog's head. "Just for a little while," he said softly, as much to himself as to Shadow, though he could not quite tell why the words felt like a promise already bending under its own weight. Walter woke before the light reached the valley, the farm still wrapped in a gray hush that smelled of damp earth and old tin. The first thing he felt was the cold through the thin mattress set up in the front room. The second was Shadow's steady breathing at the foot of the door. The dog had barely moved all night, not even when the wind rattled the loose sheet metal on the roof. Walter pulled on his jeans and boots quietly, as if noise itself might disturb whatever fragile peace had settled between man and this forgotten place. Outside, frost clung to the tall weeds like powdered glass. The abandoned barn crouched at the edge of the property like a tired animal, roof bowed, doors hanging uneven. Nothing moved except Shadow's ears, already alert, tuned to sounds Walter had learned to trust even when he couldn't hear them himself. The silence felt thick, not empty, like a held breath that had gone on too long. By mid-morning, Walter had made his slow, deliberate circuit of the farmhouse. Dust lay heavy on the windowsills, spiderwebs stitched the corners like forgotten lace, and the sour, sweet smell of mildew lingered beneath the cleaner scent of pine drifting in through broken boards. He moved with the careful habits of a man who once checked spaces for danger before he ever called them safe, though now his hands shook slightly with age when he tested a doorframe or pushed aside a rotted crate. Shadow followed at his heel, not crowding him, not lagging behind either. The dog's presence was a quiet pressure at Walter's side, steady, wordless, faithful. When Walter paused, Shadow paused. When Walter stared too long at a dead corner of the room, the dog angled his body subtly, placing himself between man and Shadow without making a sound. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply what Shadow did. By afternoon, the small stove was warm, a pot of soup murmuring softly on the burner. Walter worked the knife slow and steady, chopping onions and the last of the carrots he'd brought from town. It was an ordinary task, the kind that once had felt meaningless to him, something to be endured between long hours of driving the shuttle for the elderly. Now, in this quiet kitchen, the rhythm of the blade against the board felt like a lifeline drawn thin but unbroken. He glanced at Shadow by the door. The dog lay stretched on the blanket Walter had placed there, chin on his paws, eyes half-lidded but far from asleep. There was something different in him tonight, an alertness that wasn't restless, a stillness that hummed faintly with tension. It happened as the light shifted toward evening. Shadow's ears snapped upright, his body unfolding from the blanket in one smooth motion. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply turned, slow and deliberate, and padded toward the back of the house. Walter felt a prickle climb his spine, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Not fear exactly, but the echo of it. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. setting the knife down. Shadow stopped near the porch steps, glassy eyes fixed on the floorboards beneath them. A low sound vibrated in his chest, not a growl meant to threaten, but one meant to signal. Walter followed, his boots heavy on the warped wood. He crouched, pressing his palm flat against the boards where Shadow stared. The wood felt colder there than the rest, as if something beneath the house were breathing chill upward through the gaps. Shadow scraped once at the spot with one claw, slow and careful, then looked back at Walter. Walter straightened, heart thudding harder than the situation seemed to warrant. "It's nothing," he said, though his voice didn't carry conviction. "Mice, maybe." Shadow did not move. He remained at the edge of the porch, head lowered, ears pitched forward, all his attention narrowed to a single point beneath their feet. The soup began to boil over behind them, sending up a sharp hiss of steam that startled Walter enough to jerk him back inside. When he returned with the pot pulled safely aside, Shadow was still there, unblinking. Walter sighed, the sound heavier than he expected. He had trusted his instincts once, trusted them with lives. Sometimes they had been right. Sometimes they had not. Trusting a dog felt safer than trusting himself. Night fell slow and thick. The valley darkened into layered shadows, and the moon rose pale behind the trees. Walter sat at the small table, soup untouched, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. Shadow paced once, twice, then returned to the porch, lowering himself with care. The dog's nails made a faint ticking sound against the boards as he shifted his weight, testing angles, listening. Walter closed his eyes for a moment, and the noise became something else entirely. The rasp of breath in a radio, the distant thud of rotors, the weight of names he did not speak out loud anymore. He forced his eyes open again. This was not the desert. This was not a burning road or a collapsed wall. This was a quiet farmhouse and a dog who would not let something go. Later, long after the stars had sharpened in the sky, Walter lay awake on his back, listening. Shadow had moved inside but refused to leave the back door, his body angled toward the same patch of floor as before. He made a soft sound in his throat, less a whine than an ache. Walter turned on his side, elbows sinking into the thin mattress. "Whatever it is," he whispered into the dark, "it's been here longer than us." Shadow's tail thumped once, restrained, not reassurance, but acknowledgement. Walter's breath caught in his chest. He had spent years telling himself that some things were better left untouched, that stirring old ground only invited ghosts. Tonight, the ghosts felt closer, less like memories and more like neighbors knocking quietly from the other side of the wall. Sleep came in fragments. Walter dreamed of hands reaching through dust, of voices muffled as if under water. When he woke, heart pounding, Shadow was standing again, muzzle pressed to the floorboards, breath warming the same narrow seam. Walter swung his legs over the side of the mattress and pulled on his jacket. He didn't speak. The silence between them had grown dense with meaning. He knelt and ran his fingers along the wood. There, between two warped planks, was a faint irregularity, a line that shouldn't have been there. Shadow nudged it lightly with his nose, gentle as if afraid to bruise the secret it kept. Walter exhaled a long, unsteady breath. 20 years ago, he had pried open a collapsed doorway with bare hands because someone had been trapped behind it. He still remembered the way his palms burned afterward. This felt different, but not by much. Morning edged into the house like a tentative apology. Light slanted across the floor, catching dust motes in slow, drifting constellations. Walter brewed coffee on the stove while Shadow waited, watchful, every sense angled toward that same place beneath the porch. Outside, the valley looked no different than it had the day before. Quiet, wide, indifferent. Walter took his mug and sat on the porch steps beside Shadow. He sipped, grimacing at the bitterness, then followed the dog's gaze downward once more. "You're certain?" he said softly. Shadow did not move, but his ears tipped forward another fraction, as if the dog were leaning into the question with his whole being. Walter thought of the county clerk's voice over the phone, brisk and tired, explaining that he only needed to keep an eye on the place for a few weeks. He thought of the family who owned this land, unseen, struggling somewhere far from this quiet hill. He thought of all the doors he'd walked past in life, because opening them had seemed too heavy a burden. Shadow shifted, placing one paw on Walter's knee, grounding him, pulling him gently back from his spiral of memory into this exact moment. "All right," Walter murmured, the words more promise than action. "Not yet, but soon." He spent the rest of the morning repairing what little he could, reinforcing a loose hinge, patching a hole in the siding with scrap wood he found behind the barn. Shadow remained near the porch, lying sphinx-like beside the spot that held his attention, rising only when Walter moved too far away. Time stretched, thin but unbroken. By noon, the simple labor had warmed Walter's stiff shoulders and steadied his breath. The ordinary weight of tools in his hands felt like a quiet argument against dread. Still, every few minutes, his eyes drifted back to the porch floor, to the subtle wrongness that Shadow had found and refused to forget. Near dusk, Walter brought Shadow a bowl of water and watched the dog drink without taking his eyes off the house. There was no fear in the animal, only purpose. Walter envied that. Purpose was a thing he had mislaid for a long time, something he'd assumed belonged to younger men with steady hands. He had told himself that driving the elderly to their appointments, carrying groceries, fixing sagging gates, that it was enough. Tonight, under Shadow's unblinking stare, enough felt suddenly like a question instead of an answer. The air cooled rapidly after sunset. Walter drew his jacket tighter around himself and sat on the porch beside Shadow, the old wood creaking beneath their combined weight. They watched the light fade from the valley together, man and dog silhouetted against the slow darkening of the world. Somewhere beneath them, hidden in rot and soil, lay whatever had called to Shadow's senses. Walter rested his palm against the boards one last time before going inside, the faint cold seeping into his skin. He had come here to watch over a house, to guard it from vandals and weather and the slow decay of neglect. He had not expected the house to ask anything of him in return. Yet as he closed the door for the night and Shadow settled once more at his feet, Walter felt the quiet certainty that the farm had already begun to make its demands, and that he would not be able to pretend much longer that he hadn't heard them. If Shadow had already found the place where the past was buried, the question that gnawed at Walter as sleep finally claimed him was whether he would have the courage to uncover it. Morning came thin and pale through the line of pines, the kind of light that looked gentle but carried the cold of the mountains in it. Walter stood on the porch with the pry bar resting against his thigh. Shadow close enough that the warmth of the dog's flank brushed his knee. The boards beneath their feet looked no different from any other weathered plank on the farm, but Shadow's attention never left that single crooked seam. He did not bark, did not scratch wildly. He only waited, ears forward, breath steady, as if patience itself were part of his job. Walter crouched with a quiet groan from his knees and slid the metal edge into the gap. The first board lifted with a sigh of old nails and dust. The smell that drifted up was damp and long forgotten. a buried air that had not tasted daylight in decades. Shadow leaned forward and sneezed once, offended but certain. Beneath the second board, Walter saw the outline of metal, the dull suggestion of a box tucked into the shallow darkness. It took both hands to lift it free. The chest was smaller than he expected, heavy for its size, rusted at the edges but still stubbornly intact. He set it on the porch between them. Shadow placed one paw on the lid, not in triumph, but in quiet confirmation. Walter did not open it right away. He sat on the steps, elbows on his knees, just looking at the thing as if it were a question waiting to be spoken out loud. He had touched a lot of things in his life that had changed him forever. Rifles, stretchers, broken doors, the hands of men he could not save. But a small metal box on a quiet porch should not have frightened him the way it did. Shadow watched his face more than the chest now, head tilted slightly, reading him with the same steady attention he gave to the road when deer crossed at dusk. "All right," Walter said softly, more to the dog than to himself, and flipped the latch. The lid creaked open, slow and complaining. There was no sparkle inside, no glitter of stolen wealth. Instead, there were folders bound with brittle rubber bands, old photographs curled at the edges, a cassette tape in a cracked plastic case, and 2 thick envelopes swollen with age. The smell that rose from the chest was paper and old ink, touched faintly by something chemical and bitter. Walter lifted the top folder. The title typed across it made his chest tighten. Riverbend Chemical Incident Reports. The name stirred a memory of sirens and smoke that had once reached him halfway across the world, a tragedy framed as an accident and mourned from a distance. He turned pages slowly now. Numbers, warnings, test results marked non-compliant. Internal notes that spoke of costs and delays where men should have been mentioned instead. At the back of the folder, a single agreement lay folded, its edges worn from being handled too many times. His eyes found the signature before he could stop them. The name was his brother's. Daniel Briggs. Written in the same looping hand that once signed birthday cards and fishing permits. Walter's fingers tightened until the paper creased. The agreement was clear enough. Money paid, silence promised. No further claims. The photographs were next. One showed a group of plant workers standing in loose formation by a chain-link fence, their smiles careless, unguarded in the way people smile before they know how short time can be. Walter recognized one face immediately, the wide grin and wind-tousled hair of Tom McAllister. Tom from the volunteer fire crew. Tom who once let Walter borrow his truck without asking questions. Tom whose wife, Mary, had walked through town like a hollowed woman after the explosion, her boys clinging to her skirt with eyes too old for their faces. Another photo showed the fence after the blast, covered in flowers and handwritten notes. Walter swallowed hard. Beneath the photos lay the cassette tape. A handwritten label read, Shift B, 1 week before. He did not need to hear it yet to understand what it might hold. Voices of men who did not know they were already being measured in hours. The envelopes of money were last. He eased one open just enough to glimpse the old-style bills inside. Hush money. The word came to him with the bitterness of rust. Shadow pressed his head gently against Walter's thigh, a silent anchor while the weight of the past settled like stone in Walter's chest. He closed the chest carefully and carried it inside, setting it near the small kitchen table where the morning light could not soften what it meant. For a long while, he simply stood at the sink with cold water running over his hands, watching dirt and rust stain swirl away as if it were possible to wash away the knowledge as easily. His reflection in the cracked mirror looked older than it had a week ago. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper. By late afternoon, the decision to go into town had formed without words. He selected only a few copies from the chest, one photograph, one page of the agreement, and slid them into his bag. Shadow rose at once, ready for the road, as if the choice had been a joint one. The cafe lights were warm against the early dusk, a small square of gold on the struggling main street. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and butter and baked sugar. Linda Hart sat at her usual table by the window. She was in her early 50s, medium height with a soft sturdiness to her build that years of responsibility had shaped rather than worn down. Her dark hair, threaded with silver, was twisted low at her neck, and her glasses rested at the edge of her nose, where she pushed them when she needed to see clearly. There was kindness in her face, but also a quiet resilience that came from surviving what she never spoke about much. When Walter stepped inside with Shadow at his heel, she smiled as if she had been waiting without knowing she was. They spoke first of small things, the cold setting in early, the shuttle schedule, Mrs. Henley's slow recovery. Shadow lay under the table with his flank against Walter's boot, grounding him. At last, Linda's gaze sharpened. "You didn't come all this way to talk about weather," she said gently. Walter nodded and slid the photograph across the table. Linda's breath caught when she saw Tom McAllister's face. Then she read the document, her lips pressing into a thin, thoughtful line. Walter did not tell her everything, not at first. Only that the report had been hidden for decades, that money had changed hands, that some families had been denied the truth of how their men died. Linda listened without interrupting, her fingers folded tightly around her mug when he spoke of the silence that had been bought. Her eyes lifted to his. "This would change things," she said quietly. "For all of them." Walter stared at his hands. "It would also ruin a name that already barely means anything," he replied. "My brothers." The word hung heavy between them. Linda's voice softened. "And what about the names carved into the stone out by the cemetery?" she asked. "Do they mean nothing?" Shadow shifted under the table, resting his chin on Walter's foot as if to steady him. Walter felt the old tug-of-war rise inside his chest, loyalty against truth, blood against justice. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to be the one who opens this," he admitted. Linda reached across the table and laid her hand near his, not quite touching. "You don't have to decide tonight," she said. "But those families have waited 20 years without knowing what they were waiting for. Sometimes, the truth is the only thing that lets grief finish its work." Walter left the cafe with the cold biting sharper than before. The lights behind him blurred as his eyes stung, not quite with tears, but with the ache that comes before them. Shadow walked close at his side all the way back to the truck, steady and sure. As Walter drove the dark road back toward the farm, the papers lay heavy in his bag, and the silence in the cab felt full of unsaid names. He did not yet know what he would choose, only that the past was no longer sleeping quietly beneath the floor. And for the first time since he had set foot on the farm, Walter feared that doing nothing might take more courage than facing what waited inside that rusted chest. The days that followed blurred into a thin stretch of gray sky and small routines, the kind of in-between time Walter knew too well from his years overseas. Waiting, watching, pretending things were normal when every nerve said they weren't. He drove the shuttle in the mornings, easing old knees up courthouse steps and helping frail hands with seat belts, shadow riding shotgun when the route allowed it. In the afternoons, he went back up the dirt road to the farm, cooked simple meals, stacked a little wood, pretended he didn't notice the metal chest sitting just inside the kitchen like an extra ghost. On the third morning, Linda called him at the house before he left for town. Her voice on the line was brisk, in the way that meant she was holding something heavier underneath. "Walter, can you stop by the office before your shift?" she asked. "Won't take long." The town office was a low brick building with mismatched blinds and a flag out front that the wind had frayed along one edge. Inside, it smelled of copier toner and old coffee. Linda sat behind her metal desk, a stack of files lined up in precise order before her. She looked a little more tired than usual, faint shadows under her eyes, but her cardigan was buttoned neat, her hair twisted back, the same small stud earrings glinting at her ears. She gestured him in with a tilt of her chin, then closed the door, a gesture that always made him straighten a little, like a soldier in a briefing. "So," she began, tapping one manicured finger against a manila folder. "We got a call from a development company out of Denver, Alder Creek Holdings. Ever heard of them?" He shook his head. She slid a sheet of letterhead across to him. The logo was clean and modern, all sharp lines and a stylized tree. "They're suddenly very interested in the old Carter place," she said, meaning the farm he now slept in. "Asked about zoning, utilities, how fast we can move a sale through. Offered to buy the note from the bank and relieve the town of a burden." Their words? Her mouth twisted slightly on the last phrase. Walter studied the letter. The figures made his brows lift. "That's a lot of money for a tired patch of land," he said. "Thought the soil out there wasn't good for much but grass and old regrets." Linda gave a small, humorless huff. "Exactly," she replied. "I checked comparable sales. They're offering nearly double what it's worth on a generous day. And they're in a hurry." She looked at him over the tops of her glasses. "They also asked, specifically, if the place was occupied and who had access." He felt Shadow's absence keenly then. The dog was in the truck, head on the steering wheel, waiting while Walter just ran in. "You think this has to do with what's under my floorboards?" he said quietly. Linda didn't answer immediately. She shuffled the pages into a neat stack, a reflex that betrayed more than words. "It's a big coincidence," she finally said. "Too big for my taste, and there's more. I've had 3 different calls in 2 days, all from numbers that look like they're from different offices, asking the same thing. Who has keys up there, and how quickly could we vacate the property if a sale went through?" She leaned back, folding her arms. "Somebody wants that land, and not because they fell in love with rusty roofs." He drove away from town with the letter's numbers stuck in his head like a song he didn't like. The rest of the day, he noticed things he might have brushed off before. A black pickup he didn't recognize sat idling by the turnoff to the farm road when he came back from an afternoon shuttle run, its engine rumbling low. 2 men were inside, silhouettes behind dark glass. As Walter's truck approached, the pickup rolled forward slowly, then moved on, never climbing the hill, just easing past with the deliberateness of someone counting mailboxes. Shadow, who usually watched the scenery with lazy interest, stiffened in the passenger seat. A low growl rumbled in his chest, not loud, but deep enough that Walter felt it through the vinyl. He glanced at the side mirror and saw the faint haze of cigarette smoke drift from the pickup's window as it disappeared around the bend, leaving behind a sharp, acrid smell that hung in the air longer than the sound of the engine. "Easy," Walter murmured. But his own shoulders were tight. The next day, or maybe the one after, time felt slippery. The same truck, or one just like it, drove slowly up the main road again, not turning in, just creeping by, the driver's head turned too long toward the hill. Shadow was on the porch with him then, and the moment the engine note changed, the dog rose, hackles lifting along his spine. His lips did not peel back, but the growl came again, low and steady, as if he could smell intent in the exhaust. Walter watched the dust trail fade and wondered when exactly this farm had stopped being a quiet backwater and started feeling like a mark on someone's map. One evening, after dropping his last passenger at a weathered little house on Elm, he headed back up the hill later than usual. The light had gone soft and blue, that edge of dusk when the world lived halfway between outlines and shadows. As his truck rounded the final bend, his stomach tightened. The back door of the farmhouse stood slightly ajar, a shape too dark against the gray of the wall. Walter pulled in slow, headlights sweeping across the yard, pausing a second longer on the disturbed patch of gravel by the porch steps. He killed the engine and sat for a heartbeat, listening. Shadow was already up, ears pricked, body angled toward the house. "Stay close," Walter murmured. He stepped out, boots crunching on gravel that showed fresh tire tracks overlapping the old ones. The air held a faint echo of that same harsh cigarette smoke, thinner now, but unmistakable. The back door's old lock hung twisted, the metal plate splintering the frame where someone had forced it. Inside, the house felt wrong in a way that went beyond the broken wood. Drawers in the small kitchen hung at odd angles, their contents spilled. Cutlery scattered, a dish towel crumpled on the floor. In the front room, one cabinet door had been flung open. The few glasses he'd found still here, knocked over as if whoever searched hadn't cared what shattered. The bedroom closet stood gaping, hangers swung sideways, a box of old farm invoices upended, so yellowed papers lay like fallen leaves. Shadow moved ahead of him, nose working, pausing at open doors, then looking back as if to say, "No one here now." Walter checked each room, the old habits sliding back into his bones, corners first, then doorways, then closets. No one waited with a gun or a knife or even a bad conscience. Whoever had come had gone. He stood in the center of the living room, taking it in. The path of disturbance was almost comically direct. They had gone straight to the spot on the floor where the chest had once been, pulling up the loose boards with far less care than he had. Now, the hole yawned open, empty. They had been sure of what they were looking for, just not sure enough to know it was no longer there. His truck, parked outside with its unremarkable small covered bed, suddenly felt like the safest place the chest could be, and also the most vulnerable. He pictured someone following him on his shuttle route, waiting for the right, unobserved moment. Shadow came to stand beside him, pressing his body lightly against Walter's thigh, as if to say, "Here, now." "They're late," Walter said quietly, a humorless attempt at levity. "You beat 'em to it." The dog's only answer was a slow blink and another sweep of the room with his gaze. The next day in town, he brought the news to Linda. She listened, her face going still in that way that meant she was thinking in several directions at once. "They broke in?" she repeated softly. "They knew exactly where to look?" He nodded. Boards pulled up under the porch, cabinets tossed. Nothing else touched that mattered. They weren't there for the silverware. Linda's jaw tightened. She opened a drawer and pulled out a notepad with the state emblem at the top. "Walter, this is beyond us," she said. "Whoever this Alder Creek really is, whoever's in that black truck, they're not just interested buyers. They're desperate. Desperate people get sloppy and dangerous. You need to hand that chest and everything in it over to the state AG's office. Not the local sheriff. State. They've got a public corruption unit, environmental crimes, all of it. They can protect the evidence and, frankly, you." She met his eyes. "This is not something you should be holding alone." He rubbed a hand over his face, rough skin catching on the day's new stubble. "You think turning it in makes me less of a target?" he asked. Once it's in official hands, they'd know they were too late. People like that don't just shrug and move on. Linda exhaled slowly. No, she admitted. But at least you wouldn't be the only safeguard between them and the truth. Right now, if something happens to you, whatever your brother kept all those years could disappear for good. Is that what you want on your conscience, too? The mention of his brother made his insides twist. He thought of Dan's name on the papers, of his nephews and nieces, adults now with children of their own. They had grown up in the shadow of a plant fire, in a town that shook its head and said, "What a shame," and then moved on. What would it do to them to learn that their father had taken money to be quiet? What would it do to Mary McAllister and women like her, to have the wound torn open again? Linda seemed to read some of that in his face. "I know you're afraid this will break people," she said softly. "But some of them were broken a long time ago, and no one ever admitted why. Sometimes naming the thing that hurt you is the only way you stop it from owning every quiet moment you have left." He looked down at his hands on his knees, the same hands that had lifted stretchers and folded flags and now held this mess of papers and old lies. "If I hand it over," he said, "Dan's memory goes through the grinder. If I don't, those men down at Riverbend stay just victims of an accident. No one ever answers for choosing profit over their lives." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Feels like either way. Somebody gets crushed." Linda's gaze dropped for a moment to the floor, then rose again, steady. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe this is one of those times where doing the right thing doesn't save everybody. But it at least keeps the wrong people from winning twice." That night, back at the farm, the house felt smaller than it had before, as if the walls had leaned in a little. Walter checked the windows twice, not because he thought glass would stop a determined man, but because doing something felt better than sitting with his hands in his lap. He moved the chest from the truck bed to beneath his bed frame, then back again, unable to decide which made him feel less exposed. In the end, he left it in the truck, locked, the keys on a nail by the door, like always. If someone wanted to tear his life apart, he thought, they'd do it whether the box was under wood or steel. Shadow chose his post without discussion. As the dark settled around the house, the dog stretched out on the floor between the front door and the window that faced the road, his body forming a quiet line of defense. The lamplight threw his silhouette long and thin across the boards, ears pricked, eyes never leaving the dim square of glass. Every time a distant engine sounded or a branch scraped the siding, one of his ears flicked, muscles tensing just enough to let Walter know he was cataloging every noise. Walter sat in the old armchair with his elbows on his knees, watching Shadow more than the door. The dog was not just keeping watch for intruders. He was, in some deep, wordless way, holding space for a decision his owner had not yet made. Between them lay an invisible line, one side marked family and the other justice, and Walter could feel the ground giving way on both. As the night deepened and the road outside fell silent, he found himself wondering not just which path he would choose, but whether there was any way to walk toward the truth without losing more than he had left to give. The storm rolled in faster than the forecast had promised, a low growl over the ridge that turned into a full-throated roar by late afternoon. From the porch, Walter watched clouds muscle in over Pine Ridge, thick and green-gray at the edges like bruises forming on the sky. The air grew heavy and damp, the kind of charged stillness that made the hair on his arms prickle even before the first wind hit. Shadow stood at the edge of the steps, nose lifted, reading scents carried ahead of the rain. The dog's tail was still, his body balanced on the balls of his feet in that way that meant this was not just weather to him, but information. Walter tugged his red and black jacket closer around his shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of the wool over his cream t-shirt, and told himself it was only a spring storm, nothing more. He had seen worse. He had slept through sandstorms that swallowed whole battalions and monsoon rains that turned makeshift roads into rivers. But those storms had belonged to another life. This one was coming straight for the fragile, borrowed house at the edge of town he'd been tasked to watch. And something about that made it feel more personal. Linda's sedan appeared as a pair of headlights crawling up the dirt road, haloed by dust that the wind quickly claimed. By the time she parked beside his aging truck, the first fat drops were splatting against the windshield like thrown pebbles. She stepped out with one hand, gripping a folder pressed flat against her chest, the other holding her coat closed. The wind caught her gray-streaked hair and whipped it loose from its twist, and she laughed once, short and breathless, as she hurried toward the porch. "If this place had a welcome mat," she called over the building gust, "it would have blown clear to the next county by now." Walter reached out instinctively, fingers closing around her elbow to steady her as a particularly sharp gust shoved against them both. Up close, she looked like she always did after a long day at the office. Tidy, composed, a little worn around the eyes. But there was a tightness at the corners of her mouth he'd only seen a few times. Usually when town council meetings ran long and ugly. He ushered her inside, just as the sky opened. Rain slammed the roof in a sudden, vicious curtain, loud enough that they both flinched. The old metal sheets over the kitchen rattled like they might lift clean off and fly away. Walter moved through the room on memory, closing windows, checking the back door, while Linda stood on the worn linoleum and looked around like she was seeing the place for the first time. "Cozy," she said, and somehow made it sound like she wasn't lying. She set the folder on the small table near the window, where the light from outside had already gone murky. Shadows circled her once, sniffing politely at her shoes, then sat down beside Walter's chair as if to say, "She's one of ours." The power flickered twice while Walter dug out a pot and cans from the cupboard, then settled back into a thin, anxious hum as the storm tested every nail and beam. He put a kettle on the stove, more for something to do with his hands than from any urgent need for tea. "I brought copies," Linda said, tapping the folder with a knuckle. "The parts we talked about, plus some things I pulled from the town records. Names, dates, permits that shouldn't have been granted." She paused, reading his face. When you're ready to send it up the line, we'll have a clean packet." Walter dragged a second chair closer to the table and sat, the wood creaking under his weight. "Feels like deciding who to send into a minefield," he said. "Only this time, the people stepping on the wrong plate won't have signed up for it." Linda nodded slowly. "I know. But the field's been there all along," she answered quietly. "The fact that nobody's walked across it yet doesn't make it less dangerous. It just means the people who laid it are still getting away with it." Thunder cracked just then, close enough to rattle the glasses in the cabinet. The lights blinked once, twice, then failed completely. In the sudden dark, only the orange glow from the small fireplace in the front room held back the night. For a moment they sat in the dim, listening to the storm. The sound of rain on the roof was almost a solid thing, a pounding that filled the spaces between heartbeats. Walter's eyes adjusted quickly. Years of moving through shadowy rooms had taught them how. He rose without speaking, his boots thudding softly on the floor, and fetched the big flashlight from its hook by the door. He thumbed it on and off, conserving the batteries, letting the beams sweep once across the kitchen so Linda could orient herself. Her face, caught in the light for that split second, was calm but focused, the way it had been when she'd first read the document with his brother's name on it. Shadow was already on his feet. What made Walter stop mid-step wasn't the thunder this time, but the sound that came layered underneath it. A low, rising growl from deep in the dog's chest. It was different from the warnings Shadow gave stray raccoons or the wary rumble he'd aimed at the black pickup earlier in the week. This was tighter, sharper, a string pulled taut just before it snaps. The shepherd moved toward the front room before Walter could call him back, his body lowered, tail straight out, every muscle engaged. "Shadow?" Walter said softly, but the dog didn't turn. He was listening to something beyond the walls and the noise, some frequency only he could hear. Walter crossed to the window, keeping to the right of the frame the way he'd learned in houses where people shot at any silhouette they saw. He pinched the edge of the curtain between two fingers and lifted it a fraction. At first, all he saw was his own faint reflection and the wild sway of the trees, their tops whipped back and forth like they were arguing with the wind. Then a beam of light cut through the dark, thin and white and searching. It swept across the yard, pausing on the sagging fence, the empty trough. Then angled toward the side of the house. Another beam answered it from farther left, moving more slowly, like whoever held it knew exactly where they were going. Two figures emerged from the blur of branches, hunched against the rain, their outlines broken by flapping jackets and the jittery dance of their flashlights. They moved with purpose, not curiosity. These were not kids joyriding out to scare themselves at the spooky old farm. Walter watched one of them stop at the corner of the porch, the flashlight beam lingering on the patch of ground where the boards had been pried up. Even from inside, he could see the way the man's shoulders straightened in recognition. The other figure kept going, tracing a cautious path along the outer wall, light skimming over windows and eaves as if ticking boxes on a checklist. They moved like men who had been here before, or at least studied it. Walter let the curtain fall and stepped back into the gloom. His mind sorted what he'd seen into categories the way it had in another lifetime. Number of hostels, positions, likely routes. Behind him, Linda's voice came low. "Is it them?" she asked. He didn't know which them she meant, developers, hired muscle, ghosts from his brother's past. But the answer felt the same. "It's not Girl Scouts selling cookies," he said quietly. In the shaky light from the fireplace, he could just see Linda's hand close more tightly around the back of her chair. He moved quickly then, not with the panic of a man surprised, but with the controlled speed of someone who had run this drill before, in houses that were not his and nights that didn't care who went home. He flicked the flashlight on once, just long enough to find Linda's arm. "Come on," he whispered. "Kitchen. No lights." The two of them slipped along the wall, Shadow padding beside them, the dog's nails clicking softly until he adjusted his gait for silence. Walter guided Linda into the far corner of the kitchen, near the old radio that sat eternally unplugged on a narrow shelf. "Stay low," he told her, his voice barely above the rain. "If you hear anything that sounds like yelling, you don't move till I say. If I don't say, you wait until you hear other voices that sound like they're here to help, not hurt." He let the beam glance off the radio for a second, more out of habit than expectation. There was no one on the other end of that static now, no command center listening. But the sight of it seemed to anchor Linda, reminding her of backup that might come later. She looked up at him, her face a pale oval in the half-light. "Walter," she said, "you don't have to—" "I know," he cut in gently. "But I'm the one who knows how to move in the dark. You're the one who knows how to talk to the state once this is over. We both do our jobs." Something in that division of labor seemed to settle her. She nodded once and sank to the floor, tucking herself between the wall and a lower cabinet where anyone looking in a window would be unlikely to see her. Shadow hesitated, torn for a moment between staying glued to Walter and planting himself on guard beside Linda. Walter touched 2 fingers to the dog's collar and jerked his head toward the back of the house. "With me," he murmured. Shadow obeyed, but not before stepping close to Linda and bumping his head gently against her shoulder. It was a small, almost comical gesture, but she lifted a hand to his neck and gripped the fur there, drawing a line of comfort from the contact. Then he was gone, a silent shadow slipping toward the rear door. Walter paused in the front room just long enough to shrug fully into his jacket, feeling the familiar rasp of wool against his neck, and jam his feet more firmly into his worn brown boots. The big flashlight fit solidly in his hand, the weight of it strangely reassuring. He wished, fleetingly, for the reliable heft of the rifle he hadn't carried in years. But the thought passed. This wasn't a battlefield, he reminded himself. It was a broken-down farmhouse, a widow in his kitchen, a dog who trusted him, and a file full of ghosts that people wanted badly enough to come out in a storm. At the back door, he killed the flashlight again and listened. The storm had its own rhythm, a chaotic drumbeat of rain on tin and wind in the eaves. But underneath it, he could pick out other sounds now. The crunch of boots in wet gravel, the faint squeak of a gate nudged by a shoulder instead of wind. Shadow pressed close, his breath warm against Walter's wrist, muscles coiled. "Easy," Walter whispered, more to himself than to the dog. He knew this feeling. The thud of his own heartbeat in his ears, the sharpened edges of his thoughts, the way time seemed to stretch while nothing and everything happened. Years ago, men had looked to him in moments like this, expecting orders. Tonight, only a dog watched him, eyes bright in the gloom, waiting to see which way his human would turn. And as the next flash of lightning briefly etched the shape of a man at the back corner of the house, Walter understood with a clarity that hurt that this was no longer about papers in a box or one brother's sins. It was about whether he was still the kind of man who stepped forward when someone needed a wall to stand behind, even if that wall had grown old and cracked and tired. The farmhouse held its breath for as long as it could. Thunder rolled over the hills again, closer now, the sound pressed flat against the windows by sheets of rain. Walter stood in the narrow slice of dark between the back door and the kitchen, jacket collar rough against his neck, breath slow because he knew if he let it out too fast, it would turn to fog and panic both. Behind him, he could feel Linda's presence more than see it. A small knot of warmth tucked low beside the cabinet where he'd left her. Every few seconds he heard the faint hitch of her breathing under the roar of the storm. Shadow was a tensioned line at his side, the dog's body hard as coiled wire, ears pricked forward toward the glass of the back door. Somewhere in the front room, the old radio murmured softly, its dial set to the emergency channel. They had managed to get a call out, Linda's fingers steady on the knobs, while Walter spelled the situation in the flat, stripped-down language of trouble. Possible intruders, rural property, potential violence. The dispatcher's voice had crackled back, distant but alert, promising to route state patrol units in their direction. Then the line had dissolved into static, a ragged sigh swallowed by the storm, and the light on the radio had blinked out. Walter had left it on anyway. Sometimes just the act of speaking into a void was a way of telling yourself you still existed. Now, there was nothing left to do but wait for whoever was outside to decide what came next. A gust of wind hit the house hard enough to rattle the plates in the cupboard, and almost on the same beat, the glass in the back door exploded. It didn't break delicately. It shattered with a single, violent kick. the pain erupting inward in a spray of jagged pieces that flashed white in the lightning like a handful of ice. Cold air and the rank tang of cigarette smoke poured in with a curse word, a boot, a leg. Walter flinched back on instinct, one hand coming up to shield his face from flying shards. He saw denim, wet and dark, then the bulk of a man forcing his way through the opening he'd created. A second figure loomed behind him on the porch, backlit by the brief flare of a flashlight beam. Both wore the uniform of men who wanted to be anonymous. Dark jackets, low-brimmed ball caps pulled down over their foreheads, silhouettes broken just enough to blend into shadows. Their voices didn't belong to Pine Ridge. The first man, moving into the kitchen, carried the hard, clipped vowels of some city 200 miles away. The sound of someone used to giving orders in bars and back rooms. "Evening, fine folks," he drawled, as if they'd all just met at a diner instead of in a stranger's kitchen in a storm. "We're just here for some sensitive paperwork. No reason this has to get ugly. We keep it between adults." He swung a handgun lazily in his right hand, like it weighed less than the pack of cigarettes he'd left on the truck dashboard. Then, the second man ducked through the broken door, his hat dripping, shoulders filling the doorway. "Get the files and we're gone," he added, his tone flatter, more businesslike. "You hand 'em over, old-timer, and everybody goes home." Walter took him in with the efficient scan of habit. Mid-50s, thick through the chest and waist, cheeks gone soft from years at a desk, but forearms still roped with muscle. His hair, what Walter could see of it under the cap, was thinning and iron gray. His eyes, when the lightning flashed, were pale and restless, sliding over counter, cupboard, hallway, calculating angles. There was something in the set of his jaw. The practiced way he didn't look at Linda's hiding place, that told Walter this one had made peace long ago with doing the wrong thing if the price was right. They had maybe 2 heartbeats, where everyone in the room was looking at everyone else, measuring. The city-voiced man let his gaze flick over Walter's clothes and stopped on the old military watch at his wrist. He smirked. "You look like you know how this goes," he said. "So don't make me prove it." Somewhere behind Walter, Linda shifted, a faint scrape of fabric on linoleum. It was the smallest sound, a human sound that didn't belong to the angry weather or the broken glass. The first man's head twitched toward it, gun hand following. Shadow moved before Walter could form a word. The shepherd launched from the dark like he had been wound tight and then cut free. One moment he was a warm pressure against Walter's leg, the next he was a streak of dark fur and white teeth in the flashlight's beam. His bark split the air, huge and sharp in the cramped room, echoing off the cabinets. The man with the gun flinched at the noise, his finger jerking on the trigger. The shot went off with a deafening crack, hotter and closer than the thunder. But the bullet smacked into the log wall just left of Walter's shoulder, sending a splinter of wood spitting into the room instead of punching into flesh. The acrid smell of gunpowder bit into the back of Walter's throat. At the same time, Shadow's jaws closed around the forearm of the second man, the one with the flat voice. Fabric tore, then skin. The man swore, a harsh, panicked sound, as the dog's weight hit him squarely and drove him sideways into the frame of the door. His hand spasmed, dropping the handgun he'd just started to raise. It skittered across the wet floor and disappeared under the lip of a cabinet. The city-voiced man swung his weapon toward the tangle of dog and partner. But Shadow shook his head, growling, and the other man stumbled, crashing into him and knocking his aim wide. It was the kind of chaos Walter knew, all jagged edges and bad choices compressed into seconds. The old training clicked into place with a familiarity that made him both grateful and sick. He didn't think. He moved. He pivoted away from the line of fire, back toward the kitchen corner, one arm sweeping out to scoop Linda up by the elbow. "Now," he hissed, and didn't wait to see if she argued. He yanked her to her feet and pushed them both toward the side window, where the glass was old and bubbled, and he'd noticed earlier, already cracked in the corner. "Shadow," he barked, voice cutting through the swearing and the dog's snarling. The shepherd's ears flicked, and somehow, even with his teeth still sunk in the man's arm, he began to drag backward, hauling his target off balance and away from the dropped gun. Walter slammed his shoulder into the window frame. The glass shattered outward under the force, the sound lost in the storm's roar, but the sting of stray shards familiar against his hand. Cold, wet air knifed in. He shoved Linda through the opening first, hands on her waist, feeling her boots scrape over the sill. She landed in the muddy flower bed outside with a grunt. Before he followed, he twisted to grab the radio knob on the counter nearby, turning the volume up one last notch. The thing was dead, power gone, but it was still set to the emergency channel, its antenna pointed toward a sky now full of water and noise. That, and the call they'd managed to get out minutes ago, would have to be enough of a beacon. The floor shook under another close thunderclap. "Dog! Off!" the man in the doorway was yelling, voice ragged. Walter could hear the uneven scuffle of boots on slick linoleum, the city man trying to get a clear shot without hitting his own partner. There wasn't time to see how that argument ended. He swung his legs through the broken window, dropped to the ground beside Linda, and turned immediately, reaching back. "Shadow, here," he commanded. The dog appeared in the frame a heartbeat later, teeth bright in the dim as he released the man's arm and leapt. For an instant, his body was a perfect arc against the storm-lit sky. He landed hard beside Walter, skidding in the muck, then spun, placing himself automatically between the humans and the house. Behind them, curses turned into pounding footsteps as one of the intruders gave chase. They scrambled along the wall of the farmhouse, heads down against the rain that felt like thrown gravel. The back porch loomed ahead, its boards slick and dark, the steps leading down into the yard running with water. Linda was breathing in sharp, frightened bursts now, but she kept her feet, one hand fisted in the back of Walter's jacket. Shadow loped ahead, then doubled back, checking on them with quick glances, guiding without being asked. The porch light was long dead, but a flash of lightning made everything day-bright for the space of one breath. In that instant, Walter saw the gunman behind them. Only one had followed, the larger man, the one Shadow had bitten. His cap was gone now, rain plastering thinning gray hair to his skull. His face was twisted in pain and anger, the sleeve of his jacket torn and dark with blood. He barreled out onto the porch, boots hitting the slick boards at a bad angle. Walter heard, more than saw, the moment it went wrong. The sharp, surprised grunt, the sound of rubber sliding on wet wood. The man's feet shot out from under him. He fell hard, shoulder first, sliding toward the steps. The handgun he'd somehow retrieved flew from his grip and bounced once on the porch, then clattered down onto the top step between them. Time stretched. Lightning flashed again, closer, framing the scene in stark white. Linda clinging to the porch post, eyes wide. Shadow braced, hackles up, a low growl trembling through his chest. The man sprawled on the boards, trying to push himself up with one hand while the other clutched his torn arm. Walter took a step forward, bare instinct drawing him to the dropped weapon, even as some deeper part of him recoiled. His fingers closed around the cold, wet metal. He straightened, the gun heavy and hateful in his hand. The man on the boards looked up at him, and in that fleeting, brutal light, Walter finally recognized him. It wasn't just age and rain and anger he was seeing. It was an echo of an old newspaper photo, a face he'd glanced past 100 times in the background of factory celebration shots, and always just behind the shoulder of the smiling plant director, the assistant. Back then he'd been trim, dark-haired, with the blandly pleasant expression of someone whose job was to make things happen quietly. Now his cheeks were padded, his jaw slack, eyes small and mean in a way that hadn't made it into any framed lobby pictures. "Riley," Walter said, the name landing between them like a dropped stone. The man's mouth twisted. "So you do remember," he panted. Up close, his voice had lost its flat calm, revealing the nasal whine underneath. "That's good. Then you know I've done this before. Paid to keep things smooth. Nobody needed to know what happened in that plant. Nobody needs to know now. You give us the files, we all walk away like adults." He tried to push himself to a sitting position, but Shadow's growl deepened, and he froze. For a flicker of a moment, Riley's eyes darted to the gun in Walter's hand, then to Linda, then back. "You think anyone's going to thank you for dragging this up?" he hissed. "You think those families want to hear their husbands died because your brother took a check? You're not saving them. You're blowing up what little peace they've got." The words went in like barbs because they landed on ground already broken. Walter felt the accusation hit all the old bruises. The mission that went wrong overseas. The faces of men he'd left under fire because the math of survival had demanded it. The knowledge that his brother had indeed taken a check to keep quiet, while other people buried their dead without answers. Rain ran down the back of his neck, cold as guilt. He could end this man here. A small, ugly part of him whispered, one pull of the trigger, one less piece of rot in the world. No trial, no headlines, no dragging the Briggs name through more mud. Just two older men in a storm, one standing, one not. Shadow shifted his weight, the motion brushing Walter's boot. The dog's body was solid, warm, very alive at his side. He lifted his head, looking from the gun to Walter's face, eyes dark and steady. There was no understanding of law there. No concept of evidence or plea deals. There was only the simple, ancient question dogs asked of their humans. What kind of pack are we? Walter heard sirens then, faint at first under the wind, growing louder, higher, cutting through the thunder with their own kind of storm. Blue and red light began to flicker on the undersides of the clouds beyond the trees, reflecting in the puddles at the edge of the yard. Backup, real backup, coming up the rutted road toward the house. Riley heard it too. Panic flared finely in his eyes, stripping away the smugness. "You don't have to do this," he said quickly. "Say it was a misunderstanding. Say I was trespassing, I fell. Say whatever you want. I got money. We can make this go away. Like before." Walter stared at him over the barrel of the gun, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something inside him line up instead of tear. He saw the years between the explosion at the plant and tonight as a straight line drawn in soot and ash, running through his brother's choices and his own. Maybe he couldn't redeem every foot of that line, but he could plant his feet on this spot and refuse to move any farther in the wrong direction. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the gun. The weight of it dropped from his shoulders even before it lowered from his hands. He stepped forward and kicked it away, sending it spinning down off the porch into the mud. Riley stared, confused, then tried to scramble up. But Walter was already there. He crouched, his knees protesting, and placed one hand flat against the other man's chest, pushing him back down onto the wet boards with a pressure that was firm but not cruel. "You're done paying your way out," he said, his voice quiet but steady. The voice he used to give orders in the field. the voice he hadn't heard from himself in years. "You're going to say all of this again to the people in those cars? And then you're going to say it to a judge." Riley opened his mouth to argue, but Shadow stepped closer, lips lifting just enough to show teeth and whatever words the man had dawed in his throat. The sirens were loud now, right outside the gate, the lights strobing through the trees in dizzy washes of color. Tires crunched on gravel, doors slammed, voices called to one another over the storm, sharp and practiced. Shadow threw back his head and barked, a deep, carrying sound that cut through the chaos like a flare. He moved to the edge of the porch, front paws on the top step, leaning into the rain as if to point the way. Walter stayed where he was, hand still on Riley's chest, feeling the frantic beat of the man's heart under his palm and his own heart answering in its steadier rhythm. For the first time since he'd pried up those floorboards and seen his brother's signature on dirty paper, he felt the balance tilt, just a little, away from shame and towards something that might one day look like peace. As the first beam of a state trooper's flashlight speared through the downpour and found them on the porch, Walter realized that whatever came next, he had already made the one decision that would let him look Shadow and the woman waiting behind him in the eye. By the time spring returned to Pine Ridge, the old farm on the ridge no longer looked abandoned. The barn doors had been rehung and painted, broken boards replaced, and the thickets of dead weeds cut back so that grass and wildflowers could take hold. In the middle of the yard, where trucks had once backed up to a loading dock, there now stood a simple stone marker set into a ring of fieldstone. Names were carved into its face in clear letters. Men who had left home for a shift and never walked back through their own doors again. At the base of the stone, a brass plaque carried one plain line: "In honor of those who went to work and did not come home." Walter read it from the edge of the small crowd, thumb resting against the familiar weight of his old military watch, while Shadow lay at his boots, chest rising and falling with a slow, steady rhythm. The district attorney stood nearby with a portable microphone, her dark hair pulled back, her suit too sharp for the weathered yard, but her voice quiet and firm. She spoke of investigations and sealed files, of negligence and responsibility, and then she set her notes aside. "For years," she told the gathered families, "you were told this was an unfortunate accident and that everything that could have been done was done. You deserved more than that." The breeze seemed to hold still. Warnings were ignored. Corners were cut. People in positions of power chose profit over the lives of the men whose names are written here. That was wrong. It cannot be undone. But we can at least stop pretending it never happened, and we can say, plainly, that it should have been different. No one clapped. A low murmur ran through the crowd instead, like a long-held breath finally let go. Somewhere in the stacks of documents that had brought the case back to life was the signature of Walter's own brother. The thought made his stomach knot, but Shadow pressed his body a little closer, warm against Walter's shin, as if reminding him that whatever had been done then, the only direction left now was forward. The attorney went on to explain that part of the penalties and seized assets from the company would be used to maintain the land as a memorial and community space. At that, Walter saw Ellen McAllister lift her hand to her mouth. Her hair was almost entirely silver now, her shoulders narrower than he remembered, but her posture still straight. When the speeches ended and people stepped forward one by one to touch the stone, Ellen came last. She rested her palm on the marker for a long moment, head bowed, then lifted her face and found Walter standing a little apart. For a heartbeat, he thought she might turn away. Instead, she gave a small, tired nod, a recognition that did not erase anything, but did not condemn him either. And it loosened the knot in his chest enough that he could draw in a full breath of cool spring air. In the months that followed, the place settled into its new life, with the quiet certainty of grass growing over old scars. Walter still drove his shuttle during the day, helping old neighbors in and out of the van and waiting patiently while appointments ran long. But now there was another set of keys in his pocket and another duty on his mind. Most afternoons found him back on the ridge, checking the paths, sweeping leaves from the front stoop and making sure the stone was clean. Inside the barn, no longer a storage shed for drums and pallets, but the hall, as people had started to call it. Rows of folding chairs and a few donated tables turned the empty space into whatever the town needed that week. A potluck, a quilting circle, a grief group, a children's art hour. Linda managed the schedule from her desk at town hall and often drove up in the evenings to unlock the building and stay through meetings. Her cardigan thrown over her blouse, her voice gentle but firm as she welcomed people in. When they locked up at the end of the night, she and Walter would walk the yard together to make sure the gates were latched, Shadow padding between them like a quiet escort. The pale scar along Shadow's shoulder showed against his dark coat when the light hit it, but the children were not afraid. One afternoon, a girl with missing front teeth hugged him, traced the scar with a careful finger, and announced, with a complete certainty only a child could muster, "You're our guardian." The name stuck. Before long, there were high voices calling, "Guardian, come here," from every corner of the yard, and Shadow's ears would flick at the sound as he trotted over, patient and steady, accepting dandelion crowns and sticky kisses as if this had always been his post. Walter never corrected them. Hearing that new name echo through the yard did something slow and good in his chest, as if the town were quietly renaming not just the dog, but the work they were all trying to do here. On an evening in that second spring, when the sun was sinking behind the pines and the air held just a thread of chill, Walter sat on the farmhouse steps in his red and black jacket, his boots planted firmly on the worn boards. The last of the cars had gone. Down the slope, the gravel drive lay empty and pale. Shadow stretched along the top step with his head resting across Walter's knee, the familiar weight anchoring him in place. For years after the war, he had counted days the way some men counted debts. One more to pay off, one more to get through. There had been nights when he'd watched the glowing digits of a bedside clock and wondered how many mornings he still had to drag himself toward. Now, looking at the chalk flowers some child had drawn along the edge of the step and the way the light caught the stone in the yard, he realized he was counting something else entirely. How many evenings like this he might still be given. Linda climbed the small rise and paused at the foot of the steps, a stack of leftover handouts tucked under one arm. Up close, the lines around her eyes showed years of worry and laughter, but they softened when she looked at him and at the dog. "They stayed longer than I expected," she said, nodding toward the quiet yard. "Ellen told me it helps, coming up here. She said it finally feels like somebody put things right, at least as much as they can be." Walter swallowed and gave a small shrug. "We just opened the door," he murmured. "Truth did the rest." Linda considered that, then sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Maybe," she said gently, "but doors don't open themselves." She reached down to scratch Shadow's chest. His tail thumped against the boards, the sound solid and reassuring. For a while they sat in easy silence, listening to the first crickets and the soft creak of the barn, cooling as the day let go of its heat. There were still things Walter could not fix, men he could not bring back, choices his brother had made that would always ache. But here, on this patch of ground, where lies had once been buried, he was spending his days doing the opposite. Keeping watch, tending a place, making room for truth and for healing. The sky deepened from blue to violet, and the first stars showed over the dark line of trees. Walter Briggs, who had once believed the best part of his life was behind him, sat between the dog who had pulled him back toward the living and the woman who refused to let him drift away again, and understood that at his age, being needed, even just to lock a gate, sweep a floor, or listen while someone told the same story for the 10th time, was its own kind of grace. He watched the light fade on the marker and on the field that would always belong first to the men whose names were carved there, and silently promised that however many evenings he had left, he and Shadow would spend them living as gently and as bravely as they knew how. For themselves, for this town that had taken them back, and for all those who could no longer feel the spring air on their faces. Sometimes God's miracles don't look like parted seas or thunder from the sky. Sometimes they look like an old farm nobody wanted, a tired war veteran who thought his life was already over, and a scarred German shepherd who refused to stop guarding what was right. If God can take Walter's guilt, that forgotten piece of land, and all those buried lies, and turn them into a place of truth and healing, then he can still touch the ordinary corners of our days too, our kitchens, our aches, our quiet evenings when we feel no one needs us anymore. Maybe your second spring won't come with fanfare, just with one small decision to stand up for what's right, to forgive, to show up for someone who feels alone. That's often where his quiet miracles begin. If this story stirred something in you, I'd love to hear it. Comment below what part touched your heart most, or who you thought of while watching. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that God isn't done with them yet. And if you'd like more stories like this, about second chances, loyal dogs, and the gentle ways God still works in our world, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. May the Lord bless you and keep you, give you courage for your battles, comfort in your memories, and a small, quiet miracle in the days ahead, for you and for the ones you love.